Thanks, Rod, and thank you for the invitation. It's my second time to Doha. First time was middle of summer, so this is definitely a more pleasant time of the year. As Rod said, I'll be focusing on the water immersions, so in particular cold water immersion and contrast water immersion. I knew Chris would give a really good introduction on recovery, so I'll move straight away into some of the recovery techniques that our athletes use. Obviously, there's some of the more common ones, the basic ones like stretching, like doing some form of active recovery. Nutrition, obviously a really key aspect of recovery. Massage and hydrotherapy. So this is the area that I'll be talking particularly about. And as I said, the cold water immersion and the contrast water immersion. Compression garments are something that's also popular. Psychological means of recovery, something we know is really important, and of course sleep as a key aspect of recovery. So what I thought I'd do is take you through just a little bit of some of the studies that we've done over the past few years, and without going into too much detail in each study, I'll then try to tie all the evidence together at the end with some practical advice on different types of strategies that you may use from a real practical and applied setting. So the first study that we actually did was really to look at, is it safe to put an athlete who has been exercising in very, very warm conditions into a cold ice bath when they're particularly lean? So we were looking at, in this case, some of our high-level cyclists who we know have little fat mass and not a large amount of muscle mass. And one thing we did find early on was that, yes, this was something that was safe. So it was something based on their core temperature, and you can see here they were up around 39.5 to 40 after a time trial in the heat. We put them in 10-degree water, and we found that obviously the cold water immersion dropped their core temperature, but this red line here represents a number that is usually given to say that you don't want to go below that particular core temperature to risk hypothermia, and we certainly saw that in this instance it was well above that. So we concluded that in lean individuals that it was safe, and there is quite a bit of evidence from the military world, but there hadn't previously before this been evidence with lean, particularly lean athletes. One of the first studies, this was done by Joanna Vale, who was one of our PhD students, and what we wanted to look at was, does the temperature of water matter? So knowing that if you're out in the field, sometimes it's easy to get 20-degree water, sometimes it's difficult to get 10-degree water. So what we wanted to look at in this case was, it was two cycling efforts separated by an hour in the heat, and what we wanted to know was, does the temperature of water 10 degrees, 15 degrees, 20 degrees, or 20 degrees for a longer time period, does that matter? And the answer was statistically no. Putting the body in some cold water between two cycling efforts enhanced performance more than active recovery. So you can see here this is 100%. So if the athletes did more work in the second effort compared to the first, it would be greater than 100. And so you can see here that the active recovery, they were about 4% lower than in the second effort than they were in the first. So we concluded that, generally speaking, putting the body into some cold water when you have a short period of time between exercise, like half time, for example, could be advantageous. And the water temperature isn't super critical. One thing that we did notice, though, was depending on the body size of the athlete, so even though these were cyclists and they were relatively lean, we did have some that had larger muscle masses, and it seemed like the larger athletes had better responses to the 10 degrees, but the very, very little lean athletes where they don't have a lot of insulation to protect them against the cold had better responses to the 15 degrees. The next study that we wanted to, or one of the next studies that we wanted to look at was, what about recovery over several days? because we know that in a competition setting for a lot of sports, whether it's swimming or whether it's a shorter stage race or whether it's a team sport where you have to play every day, that recovery can become particularly important. And maybe what we hear athletes say is when they have to perform at their best, which might be a final or a semi-final at the end of a competition, is often where they're most fatigued. So what can we do in those days to help with their recovery so that when they need to be at their best, that they are at the best that they can be? This was another cycling study where we had the cyclists do 5 days consecutively with 9 days off, another 5 days, 9 days off, another 5 days, etc. And they had 4 different recovery strategies randomised on each of these occasions. So the strategies were cold water, hot water, contrast water or passive recovery. And these were about 90 minutes of high intensity sprints every day for 5 days. And they had the same recovery strategy at each 5 days, and then they changed recovery strategies as they went along. And you can see here, so this study was, as I said, using cyclists. We had power meters on their bikes in the lab, and we were recording the power output, so the actual performance that they could do in the lab. And you can see here these the circles here when they get no recovery. So you can see that by end of at day 5, they're around about 4 or 5% lower than where they started at. And again, as I said before, this is often the point where we need our athletes to be at their best. Hot water immersion, so basically just sitting in a spa bath, it maintained performance better than passive recovery. Contrast water was also quite good, but the best strategy was actually cold water immersion. And you can see that they actually had some slight improvements in performance over those 5 days. So one thing that we wanted to look at was what sort of recovery strategy is best for different types of exercise. So in the past, we'd had a situation where everyone did cold water immersion or everyone did contrast water. And it came to the point where we thought, logically, there's probably different types of recovery required for different types of sports. Given that, we decided to look at weight training, and in particular this was eccentric exercise, so this was some serious muscle damage. And so the reason we chose this, obviously it's an extreme, but we wanted to see whether, if there was no effect in this environment with serious muscle damage, we're unlikely to see an effect in the normal training situation. Again, we had cold water immersion, hot water immersion and contrast water immersion, each compared to passive. I'm sure all of you know about the repeated bout effect with eccentric exercise, so we had to have separate groups. And what you can see is this is data collected on a force platform where they're doing a squat jump, and what we were doing was looking at their performance over consecutive days with the same recovery strategy. And you can see here with cold water immersion, you get an initial baseline, a big drop in performance, and then you can see with cold water immersion it improves back to baseline a lot better than simply doing no recovery. When you compare hot water immersion to passive recovery, so to doing nothing, there was no difference. So there was no benefits to putting someone in the hot water. However, the contrast water immersion was actually the best strategy, and you can see that after 24 hours there was already a significant difference between doing contrast water therapy and doing no recovery. So that kind of led us to the idea that if you've got some form of muscle damage, that the contrast water therapy may be slightly better than cold water immersion, but they're both quite good strategies to use. We'd obviously had a bit of a focus on cycling and resistance training, so then the next question was to start to look at both cycling and running, but to look at the duration of water immersion. So sometimes we work with athletes who might have to go to school and they have training commitments, and sometimes they don't have a lot of time to do lots of things in their day. So what sorts of, contrast water therapy be useful with 6 minutes, with 12 minutes, with 18 minutes? And you can actually see here that in this instance, so this is cycling, and I won't go through all the details, but just to show that 12 minutes of contrast water therapy was actually pretty good. And in the case of running, where we looked at, again, 2 running efforts separated by different durations of time, we actually found in this instance that looking at the 6 degrees was not so great, and the 12 and the 18 were able to maintain performance. So then we started to think about what are some of the mechanisms, and Chris highlighted this, that potentially there has been some research that's shown that perceptions of sleep quality are improved with some forms of hydrotherapy, and we know that, and maybe Chuck will talk about this maybe at some point, but we know that body temperature is highly related to sleep. Obviously, body temperature changes with exercise. Again, obviously, body temperature changes with water immersion. We know that changing skin temperature can change how long it takes you to fall asleep. So one of the things that we have become interested in is, can hydrotherapy actually help an athlete sleep? And I just popped this slide in. We've got Charlie and Greg here, who are from the Appleton Institute in Adelaide, and we've done a few years now worth of research with them looking at sleep in our athletes. And one of the first studies that Charlie analysed was putting sleep watches on our swimmers in the lead up to Beijing. So we had several of our swimmers volunteered to wear actigraphy, so an accelerometer worn on the wrist, just to look at how these athletes are sleeping. Because subjectively, I'd had many athletes tell me that they don't think they sleep that well, but we hadn't had any real information. And part of this research was really interesting to show that when athletes have days off, so this is training here, when athletes have days off, their sleep patterns are very different. And the actual, and you can see here there's data for training days and data for rest days. You can see here bedtime, they were going to bed about 10 o'clock on training days, bit after midnight on rest days. Their wake up times are around 5:45, knowing they have to be at training at 6. They're waking up, they're walking over the road, and they're pretty much almost still asleep when they turn up to their training session, because it is obviously quite early in the morning. A lot shorter amount of time in bed on training days compared to rest days, and interestingly, some quite low sleep efficiencies. And I know Chuck's talking about sleep, so I'm not going to talk any more about any of the sleep research that we've done, but to show that it has been for us a real area of interest, and to be able to link with the sleep laboratory has been great to get more information on how we can help our athletes sleep. One area that I'm particularly interested in when it comes to recovery is the brain. So maybe there's, obviously with water immersion, there's mechanisms potentially related to the temperature, to the hydrostatic pressure. Maybe there's an influence on sleep. But we know with cold water immersion in particular, there's an analgesic effect, which can have an influence on pain and inflammation. There's some evidence, and this is not in athletes, this is just in some of the really early research on recovery in terms of hydrotherapy and water immersion, that there's changes in beta endorphin release. There's potentially some changes in dopamine, which we know is really important for mood and sleep and motivation. And also there's been some evidence that there's changes in serotonin and noradrenaline. And again, we know, and from Chris's presentation, changes in mood and reductions in depressive symptoms. Again, they may be related to some of these neurotransmitters that might be released with water immersion. So we have a cooling effect, a hydrostatic pressure effect, if done properly. We potentially may have an influence on sleep. That question's still yet to be 100% answered, but maybe we also have strong effects on mood and perception. So we have athletes, we can have up to 1,000 athletes a week through our centre, and we certainly notice a difference between the athletes when they walk out of the door to when they walk in the door. There's definitely changes in mood and definitely decreases in their perceptions of fatigue. So there is, in my opinion, something happening in the brain which we haven't quite quantified yet. Getting on now to some of the practicalities, what I wanted to do, and so I wrote a review a couple of years ago now, to look at different recovery at different time frames. So to say, does the timing of recovery actually mean anything, and is it important depending on the type of recovery that you choose? And the reason I wanted to put this particular slide in was because here you have cold water immersion and here you have contrast water immersion. So you can see there's more cold water immersion studies than contrast water. And what you had to do a log of time, unfortunately, because there's big variations in time. But this here represents changes in performance. So if you're above the line here, it's suggesting that you have improvements with performance with these recovery strategies. If you're below the line, you can suggest that you can have decreases in performance. And I thought it was important to include some of these dots here and to show that it is possible to do cold water immersion in particular incorrectly. So some of these studies are studies that I don't think have been particularly well designed. What they might do is a Wingate test, a 30-second sprint on a bike, put someone in cold water and then put them on a bike again. A sprint activity, we know you need the muscles to be warm. There was no re-warming period, no warm-up. Of course, you're going to see a reduction in performance. When you're looking at sprint activity, you obviously want warm muscles, not cold muscles. And some of these papers actually got a bit of press, and so then there's athletes saying to us, oh great, we don't have to do cold water immersion anymore because it doesn't work. But you take a look at some of the actual papers and you can see that there's real problems with the methodology. But that also means that if everyone just adopts cold water immersion, that it's possible to get it wrong. So when I'm working with swimmers, if they have a heat of one event in the morning and maybe another heat for another event separated by half an hour to an hour, I definitely wouldn't be doing cold water immersion with these athletes who don't have high body temperatures and who are doing sprint activity. So there's definitely things, and I'll talk about some of the things to consider when implementing recovery at a later stage. Sorry, I should say that particular graph was related to sports like cycling and swimming. As soon as you add weight bearing, so this is data collected on resistance training, eccentric weight training, running, etc. You can see that you can start to get really big changes in performance using recovery strategies. Generally speaking, a lot more contrast water immersion in this area, but you can see that you can get big improvements in performance and not as great a risk of some of the larger decreases that we saw down here with the cold water immersion. So thinking about some of the practicalities, so what's some of the things that I might think about if I'm designing a recovery program for an athlete? The first thing I think about is, do they need to recover? We have sports where they may have several days off, they may not have to compete again for a certain amount of time, and you may question whether you actually need to do recovery. Have to think about what you can actually do in the time frame that you're given. As I said, we have some athletes who are very busy and they don't have a lot of time. You might be out in the field and you've got one small ice bath and you've got 20 football players. How do you get around that? So what sorts of things might you think about? So sometimes you have to adapt what you would normally do in best practice when you're out in the field. And this was related to the point I was saying about the cold water immersion between sprint activity. What strategies have good science to say that they might work? If the exercise involves some kind of muscle damage, so if the athletes involved are running, so if they have contact with the ground or if they have contact with each other in football codes, then repeating the recovery strategy on subsequent days can be beneficial. So we know that there's the delayed onset muscle soreness, and that inflammation response can be delayed and can occur over several days. That targeting that with some recovery can be useful. And again, this is relating to maximal short duration efforts. You're probably thinking if you're a track sprinter, you'd want to be heating a muscle, you wouldn't want to be cooling a muscle. So thinking about the type of activity that the athlete is doing. From the research, the kinds of temperatures and durations of immersion that have been shown to be effective are somewhere between 10 to 15 degrees for cold water and 38 to 40 for the hot water. There's been 2 studies that have looked at water immersion less than 10 degrees, and one found no effect and one found increased perception of pain. With 38 to 40 degrees, 38 degrees is obviously pretty close to resting body temperature. Anything over 40 I've found can be quite uncomfortable. And in an environment over here, you might not actually even incorporate any hot water strategies into your recovery protocols. So Canberra in Australia, believe it or not, gets hot in summer, and sometimes we can have temperatures, environmental temperatures in the high 30s, and in that instance we might not even consider putting an athlete into a hot bath. The research that has shown positive effects of contrast water therapy have used a ratio of 1 to 1. That's not to say that 2 minutes to 2 minutes or 3 minutes to 3 minutes isn't good, just to say that that's what has been found in research. So 7 rotations of 1 minute hot and 1 minute cold gives you a 14-minute recovery protocol, which is something that's reasonably practical for most people to do. As I said, if you have a team and you have one ice bath, you have to be a little bit creative about how you work your recovery protocols, but this is what's been shown in research. So about 14 to 15 minutes are shown to have a positive effect. And body size may influence the duration of exposure. So we work with very small gymnasts and we work with very large rugby front row players. So there's definitely differences in their perception of cold. Whether that relates to their actual cooling effect, well, we're not sure. Ideally, you should expose as much of the body as possible, and ideally you want to be standing rather than sitting. So we know that hydrostatic pressure is probably one of the ways that recovery is working. So you want to maximise hydrostatic pressure by making sure that the athlete is standing where possible. So the greater the depth of immersion, the greater the hydrostatic pressure. So to give you, to put that into something meaningful, compression garments that athletes wear will probably have a level of compression at the ankle of about 20 millimetres of mercury pressure. If you're 6 foot tall and you're immersed to the shoulders in water, you're probably talking about 120 to 150 millimetres of mercury pressure. So there is a lot of hydrostatic pressure that is obviously associated with the depth. So the more, the greater the depth that the person is in, or the more water that's covering them, the better. In the field, if you can't get temperatures of 10 to 15 degrees, sometimes you can just use warmer temperatures and stay in there longer. Sometimes when athletes are travelling, they have access to no equipment, but there might be a swimming pool, there might be a lake, there might be a beach, there might be a bath, and just depending on the temperature that comes out of the tap, you might have your own ice bath by simply turning on the tap. So in Europe in summer, I've had water temperatures of around about 13 degrees, which is perfect. In Canberra winter, it's often less than 10, so you have to actually add water. But you can easily create your own ice bath depending on the temperature of the water. Always consider the environmental temperature. In Beijing, we were working with some of our beach volleyball players who were coming off 50 degrees off the sand. They liked the contrast water immersion, but the first thing we made sure we did was to put them in cold water, settle down that core temperature, help to begin the recovery process, and then get them to do their contrast water immersion. And this is something that, again, Chris brought up towards the end of his presentation, is about periodisation of recovery. Like we periodise training, we should be thinking about how we periodise recovery. There is, and I'll talk a little bit more about a study that we recently finished that's looked at this chronic adaptation question. But there is don't we want fatigue, don't we want damage, don't we want inflammation to drive the adaptation process to exercise? So is there a balance between doing a little bit of recovery to help the athlete get more out of each training session, or by doing too much recovery, can we maybe dampen adaptation? And there's sort of theories for and against both of those, and I'll talk about some of the one of the projects that we've recently finished. But it is something that's probably worth considering. If you are a football player, you're in a base period of training where you're trying to build your aerobic capacity, maybe you don't need to be doing recovery every day. If you're in a competition set period where you're playing every week or 3 times a week, absolutely include your recovery. But maybe there's times to think about not including recovery because you want to drive some of those basic adaptations. So this is a project that we did a couple of years ago now in Canberra, and what we wanted to look at was the effect of cold water immersion on adaptation to training. We worked with Charlie and Greg and they assessed sleep, and we wanted to look at the effect of cold water immersion on sleep and training on sleep. We also looked at a number of immune function markers, and importantly, there's some evidence that some of these cold water swimmers, these Finnish swimmers, have really good immune systems, and that's potentially related to the noradrenaline release and the stimulation of white blood cells. So can small exposures to cold water immersion be good for the immune system? And we were doing a few other little projects on the side, which I won't talk about. So what we did was we started off with 33 cyclists, as good as we could get. We had them here in Canberra for 6 weeks, and we did a simulated tour in the middle for 3 weeks. So we increased their training volume for 3 weeks. We had 2 groups. One group got cold water immersion 4 times a week, and the other group got nothing. One thing that we felt it was really important to do from a research perspective is to match the groups not only on their baseline performance ability, but match them on how much they believe in recovery. Because if you believe in recovery and you get recovery, you could have a completely different response to if you don't believe in recovery and you get recovery, or vice versa. So we felt it was really important that we matched the athletes according to their belief in how much they thought it would or wouldn't work. Our strategy was cold water immersion 15 degrees for 15 minutes. And we chose cycling because we thought if there's a sport that it might be bad for, it's probably cycling. If chronic cold water immersion use might dampen adaptation, it could be in cyclists. So they had a week of normal training, then we ramped their training up for 3 weeks, and then they had a taper period. We measured performance all the way. So all of our studies, the key. While we do obviously want to understand mechanisms, the key variable that we measure is performance. So we want to know if these strategies are actually working. And I won't take you through too much detail of some of the performance tests, but we did a repeated 2-minute sprint test. This is week 1 here, this is week 5. This blue is the ice bath group, and the open circles are control. And you can see, and that's the means and standard deviations for each of the groups. And you can see here that the ice bath group started out slightly better, but they ended up improving their performance over the 5 weeks by about 2.7% more than the control group. We used an odds ratio. 14 would probably say in traditional stats that it wasn't significant. But 2.7% improvement was something that we thought was quite interesting. When you look at the repeatability of that 2x4 effort, so minusing the second effort from the first effort, you can see that there was bigger responses. So the cold water immersion group could maintain their performance over time better by about 11%. We also measured their ability to do sprints. And again, we found about a 4.4% improvement in the cold water group compared to the control group at the end of the training block. We didn't see any differences in the time trial performance. And so from this particular study, we found that cold water immersion wasn't harmful to adaptation to training in well-trained cyclists. It was actually beneficial to several aspects of performance, so peak, sprint and repeat 4-minute time trial performance. When we did a couple of different aspects to the performance tasks, and one thing we asked them to do was self-select workloads, and the cold water group actually felt better and could self-select higher workloads in some of the performance tests. And the cold water immersion didn't have any effect on sleep quality or quantity using actigraphy, and the increased training load, though, we did see a negative effect on sleep quality. But stay tuned, because Charlie and Greg have got quite a few papers, a couple of papers that will probably come out of that particular study. What sorts of things are we doing from here in terms of research? So we've got this project going at the moment. We're looking at blood flow and muscle temperature during recovery. We've got a study going on using DEXA and trying to understand the influence of body size and composition on hydrotherapy responses. So if you are a smaller, leaner athlete, might we prescribe recovery strategies in a different way to larger athletes? We want to continue doing sleep research and understanding its importance in athletes, and we're also interested in doing some assessments on the brain in fatigued and recovered athletes. I thought I would just spend the remainder of my time talking about the Recovery Centre that we have, and talk about the way that we use the Recovery Centre. Dennis is in the room. Fond memories of about 2004. I think we started working on this with completion in about 2006. And the idea was, and I'll talk about some of the things that we were thinking with design, but this is essentially what it looks like. I don't know if anyone was at the Altitude conference. That's Philo Saunders. We used him as a model. He's a pretty good runner. So we borrowed him for the photo shoot. So what we wanted to do was to have a facility that we could use for service provision, obviously. So we have residential athletes, we have camps-based athletes. We wanted somewhere that athletes could come and have their recovery done, and from a multidisciplinary approach. So not just recovery and physiology, but nutrition and massage and psychology, as many of the things that we could integrate into the one centre. So we wanted it to be a one-stop shop. So the athletes should be able to come there after their training session, have everything they need efficiently, and then go to the dining hall and have their food and go to bed. We also wanted to make sure it was a site that we could do research in. So back then, in 2004, there wasn't a lot of research on hydrotherapy and recovery strategies. So we wanted to make sure that it was flexible enough that we could do some research to actually measure whether these strategies were effective or not. We wanted it to be a facility that could provide education to the athletes, so that one good thing about a recovery centre is your athletes are trapped. When they're sitting in a spa or in a cold pool, you have a captive audience. So it's a good area to do education and to teach them about the importance of different aspects of recovery. Obviously, we wanted it to be a nice place for the athletes to come, that had good facilities and that was time effective. We wanted it to be flexible and adaptable. So if we found out that there was some new great recovery strategy that we hadn't thought of, that we could implement that at some stage in the future. And we wanted it to have the latest techniques and technologies that we could. And obviously it had to be able to cater for a variety of individuals from different sports. So big athletes, small athletes, from athletes who are involved in contact sports and athletes who aren't. From an education perspective, one thing that we do in the centre is we provide education to our athletes about the importance of recovery. We find that when you're asking athletes to hop in cold water, they're much more likely to do this if they've been educated why and what the potential benefits might be. We have, as I said, we've a bit of a captive audience, so we include nutrition information here, as well as some fact sheets that they can take away on things like general protocols, research outcomes, sleep information. We have a flotation tank as well, and we have information on that. We talk about jet lag and travel stress, as well as, importantly, nutrition. So that's information that the athletes can read. We also have televisions just like this that have this same kind of information that turns over so that the athletes can see and read that information. So the centre's divided up into two areas, a dry area and a wet area. So in the dry area we have stretching mats and bikes. We have actually modified the centre since this picture. We now have a lab that takes up half of this space. So what we do is we have bikes and treadmills, etc. in this part, and all our technology and equipment, and then we can move the athletes into the water immersion area. We have space for massage, and we do work with some professional teams who will often do treatment in the massage space. We have nutrition, recovery. In terms of the wet area, we have contrast showers, and part of the reason for that is we want the athletes to come in as clean as possible, but also we can use it for research, because contrast showers are something that potentially athletes can do while they're travelling, because it's quite simple to do, so hot and cold showers. And we have finished recently a study looking at hot and cold showers and found it to be actually quite effective in elite netball athletes. We have 3 10-person spa baths, and so this is just a normal spa here. This spa has jets for standing, so the jets are on the legs, and this spa here is for sitting. We have cold water, of course, so that's a walking area around the outside and a deep plunge here. It doesn't look that big from that picture, but and anyone who went to the altitude conference, we also borrowed Laura as a model. And you can see here the size of that pool, so we can actually fit about 30 large males in the pool at one time. So it's quite a large space, and it's 6 foot deep. So again, the importance of being able to submerge the body as much as possible. We have a cold water walkthrough, and the point of that is to do some sort of active movement in cold water. We know that if you're submerged in water and you stay still, you'll get a slightly warmer boundary layer of water around the skin. And what that can do is obviously decrease the cooling capacity. So if you walk and you're continually moving, that boundary layer is moving, and you definitely experience cooler sensations in the water. And then we also have a river. So this is for doing active recovery, so walking, stretching. There's also swim jets in it, so you can work against a resistance if you would like to. One of the other aspects that's important for us is we have a centralised area in Canberra, but we also have other sports that are based not in Canberra. So Australia's a kind of large country, so we've got facilities down in Adelaide here, which is for the cyclists, for the velodrome. We have a training centre in Europe for to spend time for competition and training in the European summer or our winter. So we have facilities there, and we have recovery facilities in Queensland on the Gold Coast where these sports are based. And for us, one of the key things is that the education materials are the same, the advice is the same, the health and safety regulations and rules are the same, so that the temperatures are the same, so that the athletes can go to any of these facilities and have good access to similar recovery as to what we have. And then I just wanted to finish off with, sorry, I'll put that back. It's all well and good to have excellent recovery facilities where you are, but more often than not, the time when the athletes are competing at the most important for us is the Olympic Games. And so we've set up a variety of, we've had recovery facilities at the last 3 games. And this was what we had in London. So there we found a school with a pool. We set up ice baths above ground, and we had massage, we had stretching, etc., so that the athletes had somewhere that they could come for recovery at what was for them, the most important competition. This is what we had set up in Beijing. Used very similar pools. We had a swimming pool over here, a similar setup, again, a place that the athletes could come in competition to have access to recovery. Sometimes you don't have access to the best equipment. This is some of our hockey players, and this was I think it cost 10 Australian dollars, so about 40 real, from a kid's shop, a little inflatable pool. with hockey players, we cool them at half time, and there's been quite a bit of, we've got some evidence to show that if you cool team sport athletes at half time, that using GPS, we've shown significant improvements in their amount of time that they run in the second half and the speeds that they run in the second half. But sometimes your athletes they're strapped, they have tape, and so you have to think about creative ways of how and hockey has a very short half time, what you can do to cool them down quickly at half time, so when they're playing in the second half, that their performance is maximised. So sometimes setting up a small pool with ice is a simple way of getting that done. Ooh. Apologies, thank you. Thanks, Rod.
That's great. Now again, Shona's given us some time for questions. So if we have any questions particularly directed to the cold water immersion strategies that we heard about, we can take those. No, that was faked me out there. Okay.
You touched on half time, because that was going to be one of my questions.
Yeah.
Repeat the question.
Get at half time. We get about 10 to 12 minutes.
Yeah, so the question was about how much time hockey players get at half time. We worked it out that the maximum amount of time for the coach to do what they needed to do, we could put them in water for was 3 minutes. And that was effective. So hockey players are about the same. They're 10 to 15 minutes.
So obviously they've got all the protective equipment and stuff like that. What did you do?
Yeah, so essentially the way that it works is they'll come straight in at half time, they'll take their gear off, they'll leave their strapping on, they'll have their hands and feet out. So it was really just core cooling, so neck to knee kind of cooling. And then they dry off, and the coach is often talking to them in the bath, or then they've got a small amount of time afterwards. But with the trials that had occurred prior to the competition, there was a large amount of confidence that trying to find a way to get 3 minutes was really going to make a big difference to their performance. So they had to find a way to get that cold water. So the temperature was about 10 degrees, so pretty cold, in there for 3 minutes, drying off, coach talking to them, and then back out.
They went within their underwear and they changed
Yeah.
like really quick?
Yeah, really quick change. Yeah, they had everything organised, lined up, ready to go. Yeah, so it was something that was practiced, obviously, but the perceptions from the players. So the data collected from the GPS definitely showed an effect, but the perception from the players, and I think everyone knows what it's like living in a warm country, that if it's really hot and you can have a cold shower or jump in a cold pool, perception-wise, it makes a big difference. And also, it's that 3 minutes is enough to probably do a small amount to core temperature to actually have not just a perceptual response, but also a physiological response. Yeah.
Done in hot weather?
Yeah.
Would you do it we play a lot in the Northern Hemisphere, we play a lot, quite cold conditions.
Yeah. We did some studies pre-London based around temperatures, environmental temperatures of about 20 degrees, knowing that we weren't sure what we were going to get in London. And we didn't use such short time frames though, we used like about half an hour, and we found that cold water immersion was effective to repeat performance, but slightly warmer temperatures were better than the colder temperatures. So the 20 degree type temperature was better than the 10. So if the environmental temperature is a little bit colder, you might use a slightly warmer temperature, but we did find improvements in performance. Have never looked at anything under 20 degrees. Yeah, we've never looked at that. Yeah.
Just speaking to the logistics there, obviously pools might not be well tolerated, might be difficult and all the rest of it. Have you looked at the cooling jackets at all as an alternative?
Yeah, we've done some work with cooling jackets, mostly for pre-cooling. So what you don't get with a cooling jacket is obviously hydrostatic pressure. You don't cover the body as much as you do with water immersion. So cooling jackets, I would say, probably aren't the ideal recovery strategy. They can be potentially useful for pre-cooling. I would suggest a cold shower above before cooling jackets for recovery. If you don't have access to that, maybe cooling jackets. But I think you have to be very careful with cooling jackets depending on their capacity. If they have a lot of capacity, so they have a lot of cooling capacity, they can be very useful. If they lose their capacity quickly, they just act like another insulation device over the top of already the heat that the athlete's producing. So some of the garments that we use, we know you have to put them in ice water repeatedly over and over and over again. You're putting an ice, depending on the quality of the jacket, if you're using not a great quality jacket, you might find that after 10 minutes you're actually heating the athlete up. So cooling jackets can be good, they just have to be, in my opinion, used very carefully and practiced in. We did part of the study that I showed earlier with the putting the cyclist in the cold water after cycling in the heat. We actually used different cooling strategies before the time trial in the heat and found that using the cooling jacket, they actually mispaced the time trial quite badly. Teach them how to do it and they don't do that again. But first off, they actually mispaced. They felt really good at the start and then they crashed and burned towards the end of the time trial because there was that perception of feeling cold without being actually cold. So there's a balance between, and when that happens, when there is the perception of cooling but not the physiological cooling, all you need to do is practice. But when the first time athletes do it, if they wear a cooling jacket and they're not really cool, they feel good, but their core isn't cool, they can mispace quite significantly their performance task.
My wife's often suggesting I take a cold shower. Perhaps she's on. Yeah.
I would say my decision would be based on the environmental temperature first. So if you're playing somewhere that is hot, I would say that the first port of call is definitely cold water immersion. So cooling the body as quickly as possible. You may then, if you have access to contrast facilities, you might want to do some sort of contrast after that. If you're in a normal temperature environment or even a cool environment, then I would choose the contrast. But basically the way I think about it is that the priority in the heat is to cool the body down. So the body doesn't like high core temperatures, and to start the recovery process, the body really likes to be back as close as possible to a normal core temperature. So in the heat, in Doha summer, I'd be going for cold first. Yeah, half-time, showers are something, so... Yeah, it's hot water, yeah. Look, I guess, doing forms of cold water immersion isn't always the most practical thing to do. It just comes down to how much importance that you value on it. So, for example, we have that issue all the time with our athletes when they're competing in various places or when they're training in different parts around the world. Increasingly now we're having more and more athletes and coaches and staff taking portable ice baths, so blow-up baths like the children's pool, and there's a lot of different types you can buy now that are better than the kids' pool. There's lots of different options now for those. It's just having a commitment to, then you put the water in, then you have to try and find ice. So yes, it's not super practical, but it's becoming increasingly more popular, and more people are doing recovery and making sure that it's something that, especially in the heat, there's a real focus on it. So like I said, not super easy, but if you can get inflatable equipment that's easy to travel around with, fill it up with as cold water as you can get, and then top it up with ice.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Shona, for a nice presentation. I have one question about the first study with Joanna.
Yes.
Why it takes about 5 days to have a main difference between the contrast and the cold immersion?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. So what we did in that study was, instead of looking at like sort of 1 hour in between, which we'd done for previous studies, we looked at waiting 24 hours between. So look, it was, I guess, representative of if you had to compete once a day. And so what we found was that we had quite high-level cyclists, and so they just managed to generally recover enough on a day-to-day basis, but it was the accumulation that became interesting. I think if we had have measured their performance 1 or 2 hours after the cold water, we would have seen big differences, but we were looking at more of a day-to-day perspective. And so I think it was really the accumulation of fatigue over time. And you might have seen from the adaptation study that we were pushing these cyclists really hard. They felt so fatigued. Their questionnaire responses were very fatigued. Their performance kept going up and up and up, which was very strange for us because we thought this was going to be an overreaching study, but it certainly wasn't. And what came back to us from that was how difficult it is to really, really shift performance in cyclists who are really well trained. But I think with the study that we did over 5 days, it was the accumulation that became interesting. And so it took a few days before you could start to see the benefits.
Okay, we'll take one last question and go to one or two.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I want to ask you about the swimming, because we have big experience with swimming. What would be the best strategy for the swimmer who needs to compete, let's say, in the final session, for
Yep.
the hour and a half,
Mm-hmm.
and doing 3 races at the maximum performance, and what to do in between?
Yep.
And what do you think about combining, the very famous now compression suit for the swimmers,
Mhm.
very light,
Yep.
maybe with a cold shower, or just a compression suit?
Yeah. My caution around swimming is the fact that they don't get high core temperatures. And so most other sports typically do. I mean, maybe the 1,500 metre swimmers, they might have a rise in their core temperature, but they don't get particularly warm. So the last thing you actually want to do is cool them too much. So when I do recovery with swimmers, it's generally always contrast water, unless it's at the end of the day. So if it's the end of, so they've got 2 sessions a day, competition or training, at the end of the day, doesn't really matter what they do because they've got 12 hours or however long till they have to be back the next morning. So cold water or contrast, I think, are both good for swimmers. If you're looking where there's a time frame between sort of a morning session, an afternoon session, or within sessions, generally speaking, most of the athletes that I would work with, if there's a short amount of time, they will prioritise swim down. If they've got a little bit more time, then we'll probably include contrast water immersion rather than cold, because we obviously want to be careful about cooling them too much. Our athletes do wear compression. They do like compression. There's no evidence that I've seen, I could be wrong, but no evidence in swimmers that I've seen, but in cyclists there is for using compression in the recovery block. So I guess to summarise, I would say I think about the duration between the next time they swim. If it's less than an hour, I'm very conservative, maybe just compression and swim down. If it's the end of the day and they've got time for the next day or between sessions, it doesn't really bother me, but if within, anything within an hour, I'm very, very cautious of cold. Yeah.
Okay, by my watch it's 10:53 and we're going to start sharp at 11:10. So come out now and have some morning tea and we'll see you back here in 17 minutes.